Okay, so thank you for joining us. I'm John Long from Launchable. I'm here with Alastair, Wilkes, and Derek Campbell. Derek works at Freshly on the test automation team, and we ran into Derek a couple of weeks ago, actually, and we're chatting with him a little bit about kind of a risk-based approach to testing. And he had some really interesting thoughts. So we thought we'd, record this and just share for other people to benefit from. So first of all, Derek, welcome. Glad to have you. Could we just tell us a little bit about your background? It's a little bit unconventional, right?
Yeah, a little bit. So I manage the DevOps and test automation teams here at Freshly, but in my past life, I actually taught first and second grade. That is until my path led me to software development. I've actually got a pretty interesting article on LinkedIn where I kind of detail what that journey looked like. I believe that my success in engineering as a whole has really been due to tenacity and luck and integrity. So I really believe that those tenets have just kind of guided me to success in this field, and looking forward to continued success. As for my domain of expertise, so to speak, I've basically specialized exclusively in software testing and leadership for most of my career in engineering, with a focus on QA transformation, staffing and engagement, process improvement and implementation, risk-based testing, which you mentioned before, design and development of test data management solutions. So I've come up with some creative solutions, both for Freshly and for previous companies I've worked with. And obviously test automation and DevOps are areas of specialization for me. And lastly, agile delivery. So I'm really passionate about the agile process, especially as far as Kanban is concerned. Overall, I think of myself as being pretty easygoing, and I try not to take things too seriously.
Yeah. So how did you get from elementary school teacher to tech, all that?
Yeah, as I said, I really just kind of lucked out, but in a nutshell, I was working as a teacher, teaching first and second grade at an amazing charter school. I was very lucky to get hired right out of college. And, I had always promised myself that I would teach children in the way that I knew was right, based on, my own values and based on contemporary science. And the science detailed that we should teach children in a certain way, and that they learn best in this way. And unfortunately, our education system here in the United States is very outdated, and it's based in centuries old practices. And much of our legislation today that guides education does not coincide with current research trends. So I was kind of being forced to teach in a way that wasn't congruent with my values, in addition to dealing with some life stuff, along with some health issues related to standing for long periods of time, and a very, very toxic relationship. And it was a perfect storm for me to not feel satisfied with what I was doing. And I'll never forget the day that I decided to leave teaching. I was in a car getting a ride home from a fellow teacher. She was taking her 3 kids home, and me, because I couldn't afford a car and didn't want to wait for the bus. So she was taking me home, and I confided in her how scared I was about having this student loan debt, this massive amount of student loan debt, and that I felt I would never be able to pay it off. And she looked over to me, this 50-year-old woman looked over to me, smiled, and said, "Oh, sweetie, I'm still paying mine off." And it was at that point that I said, okay, I don't think this is going to be for me. I don't want to have this, this cloud over my head for the next few decades as I try to find success and, take care of a family and all of that. So I said, all right, I'm going to leave education. I didn't really have a plan. I just knew that was no longer my path. And so I left, and I went the extreme route and moved to a different state, and went into a completely different career, actually medicine. So I got a certificate as a certified nursing assistant, and managed a care home in the state of Georgia, where I took care of the elderly for a period of about 4 months until I realized that wasn't my calling either. So had a lot of I guess indecision in my early days, but I learned a lot from that experience, dealing with people specifically that are, dealing with Alzheimer's and diseases of that nature, and learned to be much more compassionate and even more patient than when dealing with first and second graders. So I learned a lot from that experience. It was great, but decided it was time to try something new. And I had stumbled across a book. I might still have it on my bookshelf. It's called How Computers Work. And I saw it at Barnes and Noble. And I thought, man, computers are so cool. They're so cool, but I could never do anything with computers because I'm not a math whiz. I'm just, some Joe Schmo. And I said, but you know what? I'm curious. I'm going to learn about it anyway. So I grabbed the book, and it just sparked my curiosity, and I was so excited about it that I decided to take a risk and go back to school. And so I did. I took a semester of community college courses in, the good standards of Java, object-oriented program and design, SQL, nice. Just the real bare bones stuff, and struggled through it. Oh man, it's so hard learning to program. So anyone that tells you otherwise, they must be a natural, but it was hard, and I had to dedicate myself to it. And many times I thought, this isn't going to work out. Like, there's no way I can do this for a career. And luckily for me, that tenacity paid off, and I kept persevering and kept pushing through and kept learning and pouring myself into learning. And during a capstone presentation for one of my classes, I was lucky enough that a headhunter for American Express was looking for interns. And they happened to walk into the class for only 2 presentations. One of those was mine. And they liked what they saw. I put a lot of time and energy into that project, and they appreciated it. So they went over to my teacher, whispered in their ear, left the classroom. And then later my teacher comes over to me and says, how would you like to intern for American Express?
Nice. That's how it started.
And that's how it started. And of course I said yes, and here we are.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of us come at tech from unconventional backgrounds. I haven't met the conventional tech background yet. That's kind of funny. Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, so they say the rest is history, right? So I'm curious how that led into a career in not just in software, but in software testing. Maybe you could talk about how your career has developed in that area a little bit.
Sure, absolutely. So I worked at American Express for a little over a year as a intern / contractor. So they had a special way that they navigated that for legal purposes. So initially it was an intern, and then you become a contractor. And I was a systems engineer is what they called it. And I worked on a few of the internal applications for American Express, including their very own source control management system for one of their big mainframes. And that was great. I got a ton of experience writing Java code and writing JavaScript code, doing the whole HTML, CSS, so lots of on-the-job experience. And just got to a point where I wasn't feeling like I enjoyed it as much as I thought I would, and I just didn't feel like that was going to be a good fit for me in the long term. And so I find something else. And, I left American Express, and I actually went to work at a wine store for a short period of time. And it was at that time, I know, just all over the place. It was at that time a small company reached out to me, a startup, about joining their team as a QA engineer. And I told them,
really?
Yeah. And I told them, look, I've not done QA before, so I'm not sure how good I'll be at it, but I've coded in JavaScript, and I've done some stuff in Java, so I'm sure I can pick it up. And they took a chance on me, and I got in there, and their test automation suite was written by interns with even less experience than I had. So we scrapped that, and I was able to build a framework from the ground up. And that's a very rare experience in in test automation period is having the opportunity to build a suite from the ground up, and especially that early in your career. So I really lucked out having that opportunity, and I made a lot of mistakes. I'll be honest. Looking back at the code I wrote many years ago, I'm not proud of it, but we grow. That's how
we learn.
Right? Yeah, exactly. But I learned a lot from that experience. I learned a lot about what's right and what's wrong in test automation. And my next assignment came in as a test automation engineer again, and started working up the ranks. So I was recognized as being pretty good at it, and I've got a good attention to detail. I suppose you could say I picked up on the QA stuff very quickly because of that attention to detail. And I found that it was something I was pretty good at and more passionate about than strictly software development. I like the idea of risk mitigation, but I didn't like the strictness with which people adhered to test everything. It didn't make much sense to me. We've got this idea of delivering software as quickly as possible to our clients and customers so that we can get their feedback and iterate on it, right? That's the whole point of agile, so we can stay competitive. And it didn't make sense to me then why we would have a month's worth of regression testing on an application, manual or automate, or 2 days worth of automated regression testing.
Right.
So why are we doing this if our goal is to get to the client as quickly as possible? So I was lucky enough then to be able to create a new test automation framework within that organization for one of the other internal tools. And then I joined and created a center of excellence with that company that, I'm not sure how familiar y'all are with centers of excellence. Have you heard that before?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that pattern adopted more and more.
Yeah. So for those that might be listening to this that aren't familiar with what a center of excellence is, it's, kind of as it sounds, it's a small core group of domain experts that lead architecture, process, standards, et cetera, for an organization in that domain, and then also has the responsibility of disseminating that knowledge and enforcing those standards across the organization. So they're kind of like the experts in that domain. So I helped to create that group in my previous role, and was of course a participant on that, and was able to develop many frameworks as we were transitioning many of the tools that we used internally into, we were trying to give them automated tests, integration tests to reduce their manual regression times. And we found ourselves building, a similar framework over and over. So we standardized the framework that we were building and created something that was very portable. And, as we were scaling out these automation frameworks, we were talking, we had thousands of test cases in some scenarios, manual test cases that needed to be converted into, or should be converted into, automated test cases. And this is when I first started getting into the idea of risk-based testing. I thought, well, I don't like the idea of having a 30-day regression test. And looking at the content of some of these tests, I thought to myself, how much value are these tests really adding? If we have 100 tests on a feature that's used by one person a week, is that really providing a lot of value for the time that it's taking that individual or automated suite to run? And I said, well, there's got to be a way to find out. And so that's when I came to risk-based testing, right? And risk-based testing is all about the idea of testing functionality with the highest probability and impact of failure over less risk-prone functionality. So you prioritize things that are higher risk, and risk being determined by two vectors, impact and probability, right? Impact being the effect of the risk on the business, whether that's, operational, financial, legal, reputational, and the probability of that risk occurring. So and that probability can come from frequency of use. So if this is a feature that's used every day, right? That's high frequency of use. If it's used every day by 100 users, that's very different than used every day by 1 million users. So there's things to consider there too. And visibility, we might have a feature that that maybe isn't really high impact, but it is like the front page of the website. If it's static content, maybe it's static content, you can't interact with it. And the impact of that page being down might be kind of low, like it doesn't have any functional value, but because of its visibility, it is higher risk. If that's the face of your company, then you're talking about your reputation. And with probability, you've also got to factor in complexity. Some features are so complex that they are, by their very nature, more prone to risk. So that's just a high-level introduction to risk-based testing. John, I think you were trying to talk.
Yeah. So this sort of risk-based approach, is this something that you had done a lot of reading on, or are there books that people could read on this, or articles?
To be honest, it's a little harder to find information on risk-based testing in software than you would imagine. I mean, the approach that I take is more from risk analysis in other sectors and other industries.
Right.
So I can't really point anyone to any good articles just off the cuff, but I could probably come up with some stuff and send them to you after this interview.
Sure. Yeah, I was just sort of curious, like, how were you exposed to this? I mean, you've mentioned like working in the centers of excellence. Was it just people that you were working with that were talking about risk-based, or was this kind of an idea that had been brewing in your head as you were looking at agile and testing and all of that?
Yeah, so it was kind of an idea that was brewing in my head. There's this thought that this can't be the right way to do it. Testing, having a months-long regression can't be the right way. And both my parents are in mortgage, and my father at the time, he was doing risk analysis for mortgage loans. And I thought, oh, that's interesting.
Ask, like, which you mentioned industry, practices in other industries, and I was curious which industries you were referring to. Sounds like that's one of them.
Exactly. So risk analysis on loans, and it's like, okay, why don't we do that for our tests? If that works for other industries and in other ways, why can't we apply the same thing? And so I just started scouring the internet for risk analysis and risk testing, and eventually I came upon this and kind of curated my own short form version of risk-based testing in software.
Got it.
Right.
So let's kind of double click into that a little bit. I'm curious. We talked a bit about the method and reasoning, or maybe some of the reasoning behind this, but I was wondering if you could expand on the actual like techniques or tooling that you might use either in your current role or in past roles to achieve this in your teams.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So the core, the core thing that I use or tool that I use for risk analysis is a risk matrix. And you can look that up online pretty quickly and find some information on that. And basically what it does is it visualizes risk outcomes for a feature or project. And that's the great thing about risk-based testing, right? Is it can be implemented at any level. If you're at the ideation stages in the C-suite, then you can do a risk analysis at that level, and you can continue to do risk analysis all the way down to the individual contributor. So this risk matrix, right? So it's can imagine it as being a box, like a table, that's got impact on the top and probability on the side. And with probability, there are basically 5 rankings. I've seen all types of versions of this online, but you've got, for probability, different probability outcomes, I guess. So something is rare, the occurrence of this would be very rare, unlikely, that it's possible, likely, or it's almost certain or definitely certain. And then with impact, you've got insignificant impact, like would this matter at all? Yeah, exactly. So this is very, very similar. And each of these vectors gets assigned what I call a risk score, or what's called a risk score, right? And with the impact, you've got insignificant, minor, moderate, major, or catastrophic. And here you've got very low, low, medium, high, very high. So whatever nomenclature you want to use is totally fine. The idea is to decide on risk. And based on the probability and impact, you get a risk score. And that risk score can be decided at the project level, and then again at the user story level if you're using like an agile methodology. So at the project level, you might say, hey, this is a really risky project, and maybe it's got a risk outcome of significant or high. So we want to make sure that we have a good amount of testing on this, manual and automated. Or it may come out that, hey, this is something that we want to introduce to our customer service reps, and it might not have a lot of exposure. It's going to be good for them. It's going to be useful, save them a little bit of time, but not super high risk. And the amount of testing that those features would receive would be vastly different and should be vastly different. And that's the idea of risk-based testing.
Got it. So what does that look like? You're starting at a new company. You see, they've asked you to come in and help them apply this risk-based. I mean, this actually happened with you at Freshly, right? Like, you came in and helped them with converting their tests into more of a risk-based approach, I guess. Could you describe kind of like the mechanics of that? Like, how did that work for you? How did you get started?
Yeah, definitely. So it's going to be different with every organization, right? You've got to take into account the culture and the readiness to adopt risk-based testing. I was lucky in that I was kind of hired on as the quote unquote expert. So I had a lot of credibility up front. People were just like, well, our test automation suite sucks, so it can't really get much worse. Whatever you say is going to be better, we're sure. And so I introduced this idea of risk-based testing to them. So the first, I guess the first step is to introduce the idea of risk-based testing and to start getting buy-in from the organization at large to prove the efficacy of something like this. And you could say, well, we've got 10,000 manual test cases that takes our QA group 30 days to execute when we're doing a full regression. Let's do an audit of that. So you introduce the idea of risk-based testing, and then you start conducting an audit on existing feature tests and start sifting through them. And that's kind of what we did as we were migrating from one automated testing suite into a newer automated testing suite, is we reduced coverage on features that either were no longer used, because having coverage over something that isn't used is always a bad idea. So we just nixed that. It's like, well, that feature's completely blocked off, doesn't exist anymore. And there were some tests that were turning on a feature that was not used in production, hadn't been for years, to test it and then turning it off again, right? So things like that, you have to be very detail oriented and pay attention to those things as you see them. So as we migrated features over, we would say, okay, well, this is either not being used or not being used very much. So we can get rid of most of these scenarios and just leave the happy path and maybe a couple of common negative case scenarios. And then for features like the, join now flow as an example, or our funnel,
right?
Funnel for new customers, that's high visibility. That's where we get money from people. We need to test that. And that needs to have as many scenarios as we can possibly envision. And that also, and that also happened to be missing a lot of coverage. So for us, big priority was let's start adding coverage to this because it is high risk. And that's kind of the approach that we took with Freshly. The way that I've done it in the past is by implementing it into the agile process, which you could do too. Once you get buy-in from the organization, then it becomes, partnering up with your agile group if you have an agile coach, or your scrum masters and product owners, and saying, hey, look, this is an easy way for us to identify how much testing needs to go into this feature and how much time needs to be spent on this feature as well, right? Because this could also be applied to development efforts.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah.
And so you analyze as part of your grooming, your story grooming, or as part of your user story authoring, you include this risk analysis for each story, and you include the risk score on the story, and then that guides development and testing efforts. So that's another way to do it if your organization is a little more prescriptive.
So I'm kind of visualizing like you're doing Kanban or whatever, and as the cards move from dev to QA, if it has a high risk score, then you're spending more time on it. Is that what how you're talking about it? Yeah, exactly. You use that to guide the amount of effort that goes into the manual and automated testing, even the development
of those features.
Got it. Okay.
So what if the, what you mentioned lots and lots of tests being migrated, you do this audit process. What's the outcome like? How much time are you saving? What did that look like?
Yeah, I'm really, really pleased to say that the outcome was spectacular. I mean, we went from a test suite that could take upwards of an hour to run, and inconsistently, it was incredibly flaky. So one of the advantages of risk-based testing is, you've got higher quality tests usually. So you've got less high quality tests. So the test run time is always going to be shorter in those cases, and the quality of the test is going to be better. So when you do have a failure, it's a failure and not just because of bad data or because the test was poorly written or the feature itself is, messed up in some way. So the outcome for us is that now our test suite runs in less than 15 minutes at up to 100% pass rate, and at its lowest, 97% pass rate.
Uh-huh.
And
you've got, go ahead.
Oh, hundreds. I want to say we've got 500 test cases, at least 500 tests.
Yeah, I like your point about flakiness. It's you have this opportunity to really focus on the right tests, right? And so you've reduced that number of tests based on risk, which means you can really focus on those tests, make sure they're not flaky, make sure they're testing the right things, which should hopefully increase the confidence that developers have that running these tests is worthwhile. So I was wondering if you had received feedback or anything from the teams that you're working with about this new approach.
Yes, definitely. The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, as you can imagine.
Right.
But before, the test suite would take upwards of an hour to run, and if you were unlucky enough for it to flake, which it did very often, you could be looking at days worth of clicking the button, rolling the dice, and hoping that it passed this time, right? So going from that to adopting this risk-based approach and also using a new framework that's been well architected from the ground up is far more consistent. And even the language that the engineers use around the test suite has changed. Before, when red was seen on a build, or when a failure was seen on a build, it was called a flake. So it was the thought that it could be related to the code itself outside of the test suite didn't even occur to them. It was like, well, that's a flake. It's a flake. It's a flake. And over the last year and a half, since we've been actively migrating, now that we're fully migrated, that language has changed. And now that's a failure. Why did this fail? What's the cause of this failure? So they have subconsciously begun to trust the suite a lot more because it's far more stable.
Mm-hmm. That's great to hear. So it sounds like this kind of migration and introduction of this methodology is somewhat complete or is complete. And so I'm wondering what's next for you and your team. What's the next what do we say? What's the next bottleneck, right, for your team to go and resolve?
That's another great question. And really now I feel like we've achieved becoming a high performance team. I mean, the test automation folks are exceptional. The suite is very stable. It's very fast by most standards. I mean, 15-minute test run is pretty nice. Now our efforts are more focused on how can we improve the quality of the tests even more? How can we improve the determinism of our tests even more so that the idea that a flake exists just disappears entirely? And that thought no longer crosses anyone's mind. It's like, that is definitely a failure. What did I do? We're also looking at new approaches to test data management. How can we enable QA to adopt this risk-based approach? And how can we help give them higher quality test data so that they can, take advantage of that? And looking at solutions like maybe creating a machine learning model that evaluates the production database and then clones that data based on the structure into a separate database, and then maybe seeding some users or structuring things in interesting ways, and then spreading that data across engineering, and maybe development can use it. and test automation and QA, so that we're all using a similar data set and we can all speak the same language about the scenarios that are being used. So that's kind of the next direction, is how do we become elite within our organization? And then the next step will be, how do we share that with the community? How do we give back to the community by creating open source tools? One of our approaches to test data management is actually an open source gem called Stockpot. And that allows us to dynamically generate test data using FactoryBot and Ruby on Rails. So it's like it's a special controller. Without getting too much into the details, it's a gem. You install it into your gem file, and it opens up, exposes a few HTTP routes that lets you dynamically generate data based on your factories.
Got it. Awesome. Cool. I can't wait to have another conversation about those projects and so on. Once that work is done. Yeah,
likewise. Very excited.
Well, Derek, this about wraps it up for our time together. Is there anything that you want to leave us with? Closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts. Software development is super cool. Test automation is excellent. Risk-based testing, you should be doing it. And if you're not, then you should be looking at Launchable to help you get there.
Thanks for that plug.
Thanks very much. Yeah,
absolutely.
All right, cool. Thanks, Derek.
Awesome. Thanks, gentlemen. Have a great day.